Berlin, 1942. The winter wind cut through the streets like a blade, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and something far more sinister: fear. In the heart of the Reich's capital, where swastika banners hung from every building like crimson shrouds, there existed a photography studio on Friedrichstrasse that the SS officers trusted implicitly. They came in their immaculate black uniforms, their death's head insignias gleaming under the studio lights, seeking portraits that would capture their supposed Aryan superiority for posterity. What none of these men knew was that every time they sat for a photograph, every time they smiled with cold satisfaction at their own reflection, they were participating in one of the most audacious acts of resistance the Third Reich would never discover. The photographer's name was Heinrich Müller, and beneath the surface of his professional courtesy and technical expertise, he was committing treason with every click of his camera shutter. This is the story they buried in the ashes of history, the story of a man who turned the vanity of evil into a weapon against itself. The studio itself was unremarkable from the outside, a three-story building wedged between a bakery that rarely had bread and a tailor shop that now exclusively served military clientele. Heinrich had inherited the business from his father in 1938, just as the world was beginning to understand that the madness consuming Germany would not be contained. He was 34 years old, thin as a rail with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, the kind of man who could disappear into a crowd without leaving an impression. Before the war, he had photographed families, weddings, newborns swaddled in white lace. Now his appointment book read like a roster of war criminals: Sturmbannführer, Obersturmbannführer, Hauptsturmführer. Men whose hands were stained with blood came to him seeking immortality in silver halide and gelatin. The darkroom in the back of his studio, where he spent hours in chemical-scented darkness, had become something far more dangerous than a place to develop film. It had become a dead drop, a communication hub, a vital node in the invisible network of resistance that most Germans either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. Heinrich's journey into resistance hadn't begun with grand declarations or patriotic fervor. It had started with a knock on his door in the spring of 1941. Anna Becker stood there, a woman he vaguely remembered from his university days, now hollow-cheeked and wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told him that the resistance needed someone with access, someone the Nazis trusted, someone whose profession gave them reason to be in a dark room for hours without arousing suspicion. She told him that photographers could hide things in photographs, messages encrypted in the grain of the image itself, intelligence coded into the contrast and exposure that only trained eyes could read. She told him that every portrait of an SS officer was an opportunity to gather information, to document faces, to note insignias and medals that revealed deployments and operations. She told him he could save lives. Heinrich had wanted to say no, had wanted to close the door and pretend the conversation never happened. But then Anna had shown him a photograph of her own, her brother, emaciated and hollow-eyed, taken secretly inside Sachsenhausen concentration camp, just weeks before he died. The technical aspects of his espionage were deceptively simple, which made them brilliant. During portrait sessions, Heinrich would engage his subjects in conversation, his questions seemingly born of professional interest and mild sycophancy. Where had the officer been stationed? What campaigns had he participated in? Which divisions were being rotated to the Eastern Front? The SS men, flush with pride and the assumed superiority of their position, talked freely. They bragged, they complained, they revealed. Heinrich's photographic memory, honed by years of remembering clients' preferences and technical specifications, absorbed every detail. In the darkroom, working with an efficiency born of practice, he would create 2 versions of each portrait. The official version went to the client, flawless and flattering. The second version, printed on special paper obtained through the resistance network, contained microscopic perforations made with a modified pin tool, each pinprick corresponding to letters in a cipher. Words emerged in the pattern of grain, in the subtle variations of tone. Troop movements, officer names, strategic discussions overheard in casual conversation. The darkroom became his confessional, his sanctuary, and his prison all at once. The red safe light cast everything in the color of blood as he worked, breathing in the sharp tang of developer and fixer, his hands perpetually stained with chemicals that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Every enlarged portrait he printed was an interrogation of conscience. These were men who ordered executions, who implemented genocidal policies, who wore their monstrosity as medals. Yet here he was, perfecting their images, making them look noble and dignified through careful lighting and retouching. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Sometimes, while burning and dodging a print to achieve the perfect tonal range, he would think about the irony. He was using the same techniques to beautify monsters that he used to hide messages that might contribute to their destruction. The photographs he handed to Klaus Richter, a particularly vicious Obersturmbannführer who visited monthly, were masterpieces of technical skill. Richter never knew that the print Heinrich kept for the studio archives contained encoded intelligence about Gestapo raid schedules in the microdots hidden within the photographic emulsion. By the winter of 1942, Heinrich Müller had photographed over 200 SS officers. His studio was booked months in advance, recommended by the Reich leadership itself as the preferred portraitist for military personnel. His hands shook less now when he developed the secret prints, though the fear never truly left. Anna Becker visited every 3 weeks, always at different times, always with different pretexts. A sister wanting a family portrait, an old friend passing through Berlin, a potential client making inquiries. She would leave with a package of sample prints, each one containing intelligence that would be smuggled out of Germany through channels Heinrich was deliberately kept ignorant of. He didn't know how many operations his information had enabled, how many lives had been saved, how many Allied bombers had found their targets because of coordinates he'd encoded. He only knew that every morning he opened his studio doors, smiled at the men in black uniforms, and committed treason disguised as art. The portraits on his wall testified to his skill. The messages hidden within them testified to his soul. The illusion of safety shattered on a frozen morning in January 1943 when Heinrich arrived at his studio to find the front window smashed. Glass fragments glittered on the snow-covered sidewalk like scattered diamonds, and the door hung askew on its hinges. His first instinct was to run, to disappear into the maze of Berlin's back alleys and never return, but panic would draw attention. He forced himself to walk calmly inside, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air that now flooded through the broken window. The main studio appeared untouched at first glance. The camera still stood on its tripod. The backdrop curtains hung undisturbed. The props and posing chairs remained in their usual positions. Then he noticed the darkroom door standing open, something he never ever left that way. His stomach dropped like a stone into freezing water. Someone had been inside his sanctuary. The darkroom had been ransacked with methodical precision. Chemical bottles lay overturned, their contents pooling on the floor in noxious puddles that made his eyes water. Developing trays were scattered, some cracked, some missing entirely. The enlarger had been partially dismantled, its lamp house separated from the column. But it was what remained untouched that terrified him most: the locked cabinet where he kept his cipher tools and the special photographic paper, still secure behind its innocent facade of supply storage. Either the intruders hadn't found it, or this was a warning. Heinrich's hands trembled as he began cataloguing the damage, trying to appear like a simple shopkeeper, dealing with common theft rather than a resistance operative assessing a catastrophic security breach. The broken bottles, the scattered equipment, the violated space, all of it could be explained to the police as random vandalism. What couldn't be explained was the sick certainty growing in his chest that this was no random act. Klaus Richter arrived 3 hours later, before Heinrich had even finished sweeping up the glass. The Obersturmbannführer's appearance was unexpected. He had no scheduled appointment. He stood in the doorway, his leather coat dripping melting snow onto the floor, his pale blue eyes scanning the destruction with an expression Heinrich couldn't read. Richter spoke with that peculiar combination of concern and threat that SS officers had perfected, asking if Heinrich was unharmed, whether anything valuable had been stolen, whether he'd reported the incident to the authorities. Heinrich responded with carefully calibrated distress, playing the role of the aggrieved businessman, while mentally reviewing every interaction, every photograph, every encoded message, searching for the mistake that might have exposed him. Richter walked through the studio slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and when he reached the darkroom threshold, he paused for a long moment that stretched into eternity. Then he turned, smiled without warmth, and told Heinrich that the Reich valued his services too highly to let such vandalism go unpunished. He would personally ensure the Gestapo investigated thoroughly. That night, Heinrich didn't sleep. He sat in his apartment above the studio, a single candle burning because the electricity had been rationed again, and considered his options with the cold logic of a man staring at his own grave. The break-in could have been genuine vandalism. Berlin was hungry and desperate, and even photography studios might be targeted for anything that could be sold or traded. But the timing felt orchestrated, and Richter's unexpected visit felt like a test. If the Gestapo truly investigated, if they examined his equipment with expert eyes, if they found the modified pin tool or noticed the subtle differences in his paper stock, the game would be over. Anna Becker's next visit wasn't scheduled for another 10 days. Too long to wait if he was being watched. Too soon if he'd already been compromised. The resistance had protocols for this. A chalk mark on a specific lamppost meant danger. A newspaper left on a certain bench meant abort all contact. But those protocols assumed Heinrich could move freely through the city without surveillance, an assumption he could no longer safely make. The following morning brought a visitor that transformed Heinrich's fear into something approaching terror. A woman he'd never seen before entered the studio just after opening, wearing the armband of a Reich Labor Service volunteer. She carried a box of photographic paper, claimed it was a donation from the propaganda ministry to help him rebuild his supplies after the vandalism, and spoke with a cheerfulness that felt grotesquely out of place. Heinrich accepted the box with numb hands, thanking her with words that felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. After she left, he stood staring at the sealed package for a full minute before carrying it to the back room. He opened it with surgical care, examining each sheet of paper for tampering, for markers, for any sign that this was a trap. The paper appeared genuine, identical to his usual stock, but the message was clear enough. Someone knew what supplies he used, someone was watching closely enough to know his inventory, and someone wanted him to know they were watching. The question that kept Heinrich awake for the second night in a row was simple and terrifying. Was this the Gestapo closing in, or was this the resistance warning him that he'd been exposed? The answer came 48 hours later, in the form of Anna Becker, who appeared at his studio door with a desperation that contradicted every protocol they'd established. She didn't wait for the scheduled contact time, didn't use the coded phrase system, didn't even pretend to be there for legitimate business. She simply walked in during his lunch hour, when the studio was closed, locked the door behind her, and spoke in a voice that trembled with urgency. The break-in hadn't been vandalism at all. It had been an internal test orchestrated by the resistance leadership itself, a brutal assessment of Heinrich's security measures and his ability to maintain composure under pressure. Someone within their network had been arrested the previous week, a courier who'd carried photographs from Heinrich's studio on 3 separate occasions. Before the Gestapo executed him, he'd talked. Not about everything, not about the full network, but enough to make Heinrich's name surface in interrogation transcripts that resistance sympathizers within the Reich bureaucracy had managed to access and warn them about. Anna explained the nightmare scenario with clinical precision, her words falling like hammer blows. The Gestapo now knew that a photographer in Berlin was involved in resistance activities, though they didn't yet have a specific identity or location. They were working from the dead courier's broken memories, a studio on a street whose name he couldn't recall, a photographer whose face he'd only glimpsed once, a darkroom where messages were hidden in portraits. It was simultaneously too much information and not enough. Too much because it meant Heinrich was now swimming in a pool of suspects that would inevitably narrow. Not enough because the vagueness meant the Gestapo would cast a wide net, investigating every photographer in Berlin who'd done business with military personnel. The resistance leadership had debated for 36 hours about whether to extract Heinrich immediately, to burn his identity and smuggle him out of Germany before the investigation tightened. But they'd reached a devastating conclusion. Heinrich Müller, was too valuable to lose and his position too unique to abandon. The SS officers trusted him implicitly. His appointment book represented an intelligence goldmine, and there were currently 7 high-ranking officials scheduled for portrait sessions in the coming month, whose movements the Allies desperately needed to track. The decision they'd made, Anna told him with eyes that couldn't quite meet his own, was to keep him in place, but change his operational methodology entirely. No more coded photographs, no more physical dead drops, no more paper trails that could be traced. Instead, Heinrich would become a pure intelligence gatherer, memorizing information and passing it verbally during increasingly risky personal meetings. The beautiful irony of his photographic work, the artistic subversion of encoding messages in the very portraits meant to glorify the Reich, all of that had to be abandoned. It was too dangerous now, too traceable, too likely to be discovered if the Gestapo decided to examine his archive with forensic attention. Anna handed him a small cyanide capsule wrapped in wax paper, told him to keep it in his pocket at all times, and explained with terrible gentleness that if he was arrested, he needed to take it before the interrogation began. The resistance couldn't risk what he knew, couldn't risk the names and methods he could reveal under torture. She was asking him to die rather than talk, and they both understood the weight of that request. Heinrich held the capsule in his palm, feeling its weight, such a small thing to contain the ending of a life. He thought about his father, who'd built this studio with pride and optimism, who'd believed that photographs could preserve happiness and freeze moments of joy forever. He thought about the hundreds of portraits he'd created over the past 18 months, each one a tiny act of rebellion, each encoded message a blow against the machinery of genocide. All of that was over now. The artistic resistance, the clever subversion, the photographer's war fought with light and chemistry instead of guns and bombs. It had ended the moment that Courier screamed Heinrich's profession into a Gestapo basement. What remained was something more primitive and infinitely more dangerous. Heinrich would continue photographing monsters, but now he would have to become something of a monster himself, smiling and chatting while memorizing details that could cost him his life, all while carrying death in his pocket like loose change. Anna left through the back entrance, disappearing into the afternoon crowds with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd survived 2 years of underground work. Heinrich returned to his studio's main room, where an SS Hauptsturmführer was scheduled to arrive in 20 minutes for a portrait session. He cleaned his camera lens with methodical care, adjusted the studio lights to their most flattering angles, and prepared the backdrop with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The cyanide capsule sat in his right trouser pocket, a constant pressure against his thigh, a reminder that every session now carried the weight of potential discovery. When Klaus Richter had visited after the break-in, when he'd stood at the darkroom threshold and smiled that cold smile, had he known? Was he waiting for Heinrich to make a mistake, to reveal himself through nervousness or inconsistency? The paranoia was exhausting, but Heinrich recognized it as a tool rather than a weakness. Paranoia kept you careful. Paranoia kept you alive. The Hauptsturmführer arrived precisely on time, and Heinrich greeted him with the professional warmth that had made his studio famous among the SS. The session proceeded normally, but everything had changed. Heinrich was no longer encoding rebellion into photographs. He was encoding his own survival into every smile, every word, every carefully neutral observation about the war's progress. The new methodology transformed Heinrich's studio sessions into exercises in controlled terror. Where before he'd had the comfort of his darkroom sanctuary, the privacy to encode his rebellion into photographic emulsion, now every piece of intelligence gathering happened in real time during the portrait sessions themselves. He developed techniques that felt more like espionage tradecraft than photography, positioning his subjects at specific angles that let him read the documents they sometimes carelessly left on the waiting room table, asking seemingly innocent questions about recent deployments while adjusting the camera focus, memorizing medal configurations and unit insignias with the same precision he once used to remember exposure settings. The SS officers never suspected that the mild-mannered photographer cleaning his lens was simultaneously cataloguing every detail of their uniforms, every casual mention of troop movements, every complaint about supply shortages that revealed strategic weaknesses. Heinrich's photographic memory once dedicated to remembering which clients preferred soft focus or dramatic lighting, now served a darker and more vital purpose. Klaus Richter's monthly visits became Heinrich's most dangerous performances. The Obersturmbannführer had developed an unsettling habit of arriving early, of wandering through the studio while Heinrich prepared the equipment, of making casual observations that felt loaded with hidden meaning. During his March appointment, Richter picked up a portrait Heinrich had recently completed of another officer and studied it with an intensity that made Heinrich's heart hammer against his ribs. The Obersturmbannführer commented on the technical quality, the masterful use of lighting, the way Heinrich captured the strength and nobility of the Reich's finest warriors. Then he asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Heinrich kept copies of all his work, whether he maintained an archive of every portrait he'd ever created. Heinrich responded with careful truth. Yes, he kept negatives and occasional reference prints for quality control and client reorders, a standard practice in professional photography. Richter nodded slowly, mentioned that such an archive would be valuable historical documentation of the Reich's leadership, and suggested that Heinrich should ensure it was properly secured. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Your archive is being watched, and we both know it contains more than just flattering portraits. That night, Heinrich dismantled his resistance archive with the methodical precision of someone destroying evidence at a crime scene. Every negative that contained encoded messages, every test print with microscopic perforations, every piece of special paper that could tie him to the resistance network, all of it went into his apartment's coal stove piece by piece. He burned 18 months of work in a fire that lasted 3 hours, watching the silver halide images blacken and curl, the faces of SS officers dissolving into ash and carbon. The smoke that rose from his chimney that night carried the ghosts of 100 secret messages. Intelligence that had already been passed to the resistance but whose physical evidence could no longer be allowed to exist. It was practical, necessary, and utterly devastating. Heinrich had believed in some naive corner of his mind that after the war these photographs might serve as documentation of his resistance, proof that not all Germans had collaborated passively. Now even that small comfort was gone, reduced to cinders and scattered memories. The transition to pure verbal intelligence gathering demanded a different kind of courage than encoding secret messages in darkroom privacy. Heinrich had to learn to trust his memory absolutely, to retain complex information without writing anything down, to carry military deployment schedules and officer names in his head for days, until Anna's increasingly risky contact visits. He developed mnemonic systems that tied information to photographic compositions. The position of a subject's hands might encode a date, the tilt of their head might represent a compass direction, the number of buttons visible on their uniform could indicate troop quantities. It was a desperate improvisation, a way of transforming his artistic eye into a recording device that left no physical trace. Some nights he would lie awake reciting the intelligence he'd gathered, terrified that sleep might erase crucial details, that by morning he'd forget the name of the Sturmbannführer who'd casually mentioned that his unit was being transferred to Stalingrad next month, information that could save Allied lives if it reached the right channels in time. The psychological toll of this new phase was crushing in ways the earlier work had never been. When Heinrich had encoded messages into photographs, there was a buffer between himself and the raw reality of his espionage. The darkroom was a liminal space where he could pretend he was simply a craftsman doing technical work, where the resistance activities felt almost abstract. Now there was no buffer, no sanctuary, no moment of separation between the performance and the reality. He was constantly on, constantly gathering, constantly afraid. Every handshake with an SS officer felt like touching contaminated material. Every smile he manufactured felt like a betrayal of the millions being murdered by these men and their regime. The cyanide capsule in his pocket became a talisman, a reminder that he'd already accepted death as the price of this work. Some mornings he would wake up and wonder why he didn't just take the capsule preemptively, end the fear and the pretense, and the soul-destroying compromise of making murderers look noble through his camera lens. But then he would remember Anna Becker's face when she'd told him his work was saving lives, and he would get up, walk downstairs to his studio, and prepare for another day of photographing evil while secretly fighting against it. April 1943 brought a development that pushed Heinrich's espionage into even more dangerous territory. Anna Becker arrived at their scheduled meeting with news that made his already precarious situation exponentially worse. The resistance had identified a high-value target, an SS brigade Führer named Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was scheduled to visit Berlin for a series of strategic meetings. Kaltenbrunner was an architect of the final solution, a man whose signature appeared on deportation orders and extermination camp expansions, and Allied intelligence desperately wanted to know his movements and security arrangements. The resistance had learned through their sources that Kaltenbrunner was vain enough to want an official portrait during his Berlin visit, and they'd managed, through channels Heinrich didn't want to contemplate, to ensure that the appointment would be directed to his studio. Heinrich would have 3 days to prepare for what Anna called, with grim humor, the most important photography session of his life. The weight of the assignment was staggering. This wasn't about memorizing troop deployment dates or noting which units were being rotated to the Eastern Front. This was about gathering intelligence on one of the Reich's most protected and dangerous leaders, a man who traveled with extensive security, who trusted almost no one, whose paranoia was legendary even among the SS leadership. Anna explained that Allied forces were planning an operation that required precise knowledge of Kaltenbrunner's schedule and movement patterns. If Heinrich could determine when and how Kaltenbrunner would be traveling between Berlin and his next destination, if he could identify his security protocols, if he could gather any intelligence about upcoming strategic meetings, it could enable an interdiction that might remove one of the Holocaust's chief implementers from the board. The moral calculus was simple and terrible. Heinrich's success or failure in this single photography session could literally determine whether thousands of people lived or died. No pressure, Anna had said, but her eyes betrayed the enormous stakes they were both fully aware of. Heinrich spent those 3 preparatory days in a state of controlled panic, rehearsing conversations, planning photographic setups that would maximize the session's duration and create opportunities for intelligence gathering. He studied everything available about Kaltenbrunner, the man's Austrian background, his reputation for brutality, his known vanities and insecurities. Heinrich planned to use the oldest trick in the portrait photographer's arsenal, flattery, combined with the illusion of artistic collaboration. He would ask Kaltenbrunner's opinion on poses and lighting, would defer to the Brigade Führer's preferences while subtly steering the conversation toward topics that might yield useful intelligence. The technical aspects of the photography would be impeccable, beyond reproach, so perfect that Kaltenbrunner would have no reason to be suspicious. And somewhere in the gaps between shutter clicks and lighting adjustments, Heinrich would gather the information that might help kill this man. The morning of the appointment, Heinrich arrived at his studio 2 hours early and vomited in the darkroom sink from pure anxiety. His hands shook so badly that he had to grip the edge of the developing table until the trembling subsided. He thought about the cyanide capsule in his pocket and wondered if perhaps today would be the day he'd need it. If Kaltenbrunner suspected anything, if Heinrich's nervousness was too obvious, if some small detail betrayed his true purpose, the session would end with Gestapo agents dragging him to a basement cell rather than with a successful intelligence coup. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to center his focus the way he'd learned to do before important commercial sessions, back when the stakes were simply artistic rather than existential. He cleaned his camera equipment with obsessive care, arranged his studio lights with mathematical precision, and prepared his backdrop and posing area until everything was absolutely perfect. When Kaltenbrunner's security detail arrived 30 minutes before the appointment to sweep the studio for threats, Heinrich greeted them with a deference that was only partly performance. Kaltenbrunner himself arrived exactly on time, accompanied by 4 SS guards who positioned themselves at strategic points around the studio with the kind of professional vigilance that made casual intelligence gathering seem impossible. The brigade Führer was tall, with a face that photographs never quite captured accurately, harder than images suggested, with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw as either useful or disposable. He shook Heinrich's hand with a grip that felt like a test of strength, and his first words were not pleasantries, but a blunt question about how long the session would take. Heinrich responded with the exact timing he'd calculated. 45 minutes for a properly executed portrait that would do justice to the Brigade Führer's rank and accomplishments. Kaltenbrunner grunted approval and sat in the posing chair with the stiff formality of a man unaccustomed to being still. Heinrich began the session with his camera, his mind racing through the intelligence priorities Anna had drilled into him, knowing that the next 45 minutes would test every skill he'd developed as both photographer and spy. The game had begun, and there would be no second chances. The portrait session with Kaltenbrunner became a masterclass in controlled deception that Heinrich would remember with crystal clarity for the rest of his life. He began with the technical preliminaries, adjusting lights and testing exposures, while making observations about the Brigade Führer's uniform decorations, each comment carefully crafted to sound like professional interest, while actually cataloguing medal configurations that indicated recent operations and command responsibilities. Kaltenbrunner responded with terse explanations, clearly impatient with the process, but unable to resist the opportunity to detail his accomplishments. Heinrich learned within the first 10 minutes that Kaltenbrunner had just returned from inspecting facilities in Poland, that he was scheduled to travel to Prague within the week, and that his security detail had been recently expanded due to what the Brigade Führer called increased partisan activity. Each piece of information was a fragment of the larger intelligence puzzle, and Heinrich committed every word to memory while maintaining the facade of a photographer concerned only with capturing the perfect image. The breakthrough came 20 minutes into the session during a lighting adjustment. Heinrich had positioned Kaltenbrunner near the window to utilize natural light, a technique that required the security guards to temporarily shift their positions to avoid appearing in the background of the shot. In that brief moment of reconfiguration, with the guards distracted and Kaltenbrunner seated with his back partially to them, Heinrich asked a question that seemed to emerge naturally from their conversation about travel schedules. He mentioned that some of his SS clients had complained about the difficulty of maintaining portrait appointments given their unpredictable deployments, and wondered aloud how senior leadership managed their schedules. Kaltenbrunner, relaxing slightly in what he perceived as a moment of privacy, made a comment that was pure intelligence gold. He mentioned that his upcoming Prague visit would be abbreviated because he needed to return to Berlin by April 23rd for a critical strategic conference that required his personal attendance. The date, the location, the implication of high-level strategic planning, all of it crystallized in Heinrich's mind with perfect clarity. Heinrich continued photographing, his hands steady on the camera despite the adrenaline flooding his system, asking follow-up questions disguised as professional courtesy about whether the Brigade Führer might want copies of the portraits sent to Prague, or whether he'd collect them personally upon his return. Kaltenbrunner, now engaged in the kind of casual conversation that powerful men often indulge in with those they consider servants, mentioned that his Prague office would be temporary, that his permanent headquarters remained in Berlin, and that the security arrangements for his return journey were being handled by a specific SS unit that Heinrich recognized from previous intelligence reports. The conversation flowed with deceptive ease, each of Heinrich's questions prompting revelations that Kaltenbrunner clearly didn't perceive as sensitive. The psychological dynamic was perfect. The Brigade Führer was speaking to a photographer, a civilian craftsman whose entire purpose was to make him look good. Someone so far beneath his station that operational security simply didn't register as a concern. The technical photography itself became almost secondary to the intelligence operation, though Heinrich maintained absolute professional standards throughout. He took a series of portraits from different angles, each setup requiring new lighting adjustments that extended the session and created more opportunities for conversation. Kaltenbrunner mentioned almost casually that the April 23rd conference would involve discussions of labor allocation for industrial production, a euphemism Heinrich understood referred to the deployment of concentration camp prisoners as slave labor. The Brigade Führer complained about resistance to certain policies, about bureaucratic obstacles to efficiency, about military commanders who didn't understand the necessities of total war. Each complaint was a window into Reich strategic thinking, each frustration a data point about internal conflicts and priorities. Heinrich absorbed it all, his photographer's eye continuing to work the camera while his mind catalogued intelligence with the precision of a recording device. The session concluded with Kaltenbrunner expressing grudging satisfaction with the preliminary results, instructing Heinrich to prepare the final prints within 3 days, and departing with his security detail in the same efficient manner he'd arrived. The moment the studio door closed, Heinrich's legs nearly buckled. He sat heavily in the posing chair, still warm from Kaltenbrunner's presence, and allowed himself 30 seconds of pure relief before his training reasserted itself. He had 48 hours until Anna's next scheduled contact, 48 hours to hold this intelligence in his head without writing anything down, without creating any physical record that could betray him. The date, April 23rd. The location, Berlin. The nature of the conference, strategic planning on labor allocation and industrial production, Kaltenbrunner's travel schedule, his security arrangements, his headquarters locations. Heinrich began the process of encoding this information into mnemonic systems, transforming dates into photographic compositions in his mind, converting details into mental images he could retrieve perfectly when the time came. He had just completed the most successful intelligence operation of his career, and the knowledge felt less like triumph and more like carrying a bomb that could explode at any moment. The 48 hours between the Kaltenbrunner session and Anna's scheduled contact stretched into an eternity of paranoid vigilance. Heinrich moved through those 2 days like a man walking through a minefield, hyper-aware that a single mistake could detonate everything he'd accomplished. He developed Kaltenbrunner's portraits with mechanical precision, creating images that were technically flawless, that captured the Brigadeführer's stern authority without a trace of the subversive intelligence gathering that had occurred during their creation. Every time the studio door opened, every time footsteps approached on the street outside, Heinrich's hand would drift unconsciously toward the pocket containing the cyanide capsule. He slept in fragments, waking every few hours to mentally rehearse the intelligence he'd gathered, terrified that exhaustion might cause him to forget some crucial detail. The information felt like a physical weight in his skull, pressing against the inside of his mind, demanding to be released before it crushed him entirely. Anna arrived exactly on schedule, posing as a potential client inquiring about family portrait packages, and Heinrich's relief at seeing her was so profound he had to consciously control his facial expression to avoid revealing their connection. They maintained the charade for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. She asked questions about pricing and availability. He showed her sample portraits and discussed scheduling options, and only when he led her to the back room under the pretense of showing her additional portfolio samples did their conversation shift into whispered urgency. Heinrich delivered the intelligence in a compressed verbal download that took less than 3 minutes, each detail presented with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 days obsessively memorizing and organizing information. Anna's face remained professionally neutral, but her eyes widened almost imperceptibly when he mentioned the April 23rd conference date. She asked him to repeat certain details twice, confirming dates and locations with the methodical care of someone who understood exactly how this intelligence would be used. What Anna told him next transformed his successful intelligence coup into something far more complicated and dangerous. The information about Kaltenbrunner's schedule and the strategic conference was indeed valuable, potentially mission-critical for Allied planning, but it created an immediate operational problem. The intelligence needed to reach London within 72 hours to be actionable, which meant it had to be transmitted through the Resistance's most secure and most dangerous communication channel, a radio operator working from a location in Berlin's French Quarter. The usual courier networks were too slow, too vulnerable to the Gestapo sweeps that had intensified in recent weeks. Anna explained that Heinrich would need to deliver the intelligence personally to the radio operator, a breach of every compartmentalization protocol they'd established, a violation of the fundamental rule that operatives in different cells should never have direct contact. The resistance leadership had debated this for hours after receiving Anna's preliminary report about the intelligence opportunity, and they'd concluded that the stakes justified the risk. Heinrich felt the familiar wave of nausea that preceded every escalation of his involvement in resistance work, Going to the radio operator meant exposing himself to a completely new cell, meant trusting people he'd never met with knowledge that could destroy him, meant moving through Berlin's streets, carrying intelligence in his head that would guarantee his execution if he was stopped and questioned. Anna must have seen the fear in his face because she reached across the space between them and gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. She reminded him why they were doing this. What was at stake? Who would die if this intelligence didn't reach the people who could act on it? She told him that the radio operator was a woman named Sophie, that she operated from an apartment above a bakery on Mühlachstrasse, and that he should arrive at precisely 9 o'clock that evening under the cover of the citywide blackout. She gave him a recognition phrase and response, a simple exchange about bread rationing that would confirm identities without arousing suspicion if overheard. The hours between Anna's departure and his evening mission crawled by with agonizing slowness. Heinrich closed his studio early, claiming illness to the 2 clients who'd had afternoon appointments, and retreated to his apartment to prepare. He dressed in his most nondescript clothing, dark colors that would blend into the blackout shadows, and left behind anything that could identify him as a photographer or businessman. The cyanide capsule went into his coat pocket, a grim insurance policy against capture. At 8:30, as the air raid sirens began their nightly test and the city lights extinguished in preparation for potential Allied bombing runs, Heinrich stepped out into the darkness of Berlin's streets. The walk to Mühlachstrasse would take approximately 25 minutes if he maintained a normal pace, longer if he took the circuitous route that would help him identify any surveillance. He joined the flow of people moving through the blacked-out city, just another anonymous Berliner, navigating the wartime night, carrying in his mind intelligence that could alter the course of the war, and in his pocket the means to end his life if everything went wrong. The air was cold enough to see his breath, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of Allied bombers approaching their nightly targets. Heinrich pulled his coat tighter and walked toward Mühlachstrasse, toward Sophie the radio operator, toward the most dangerous moment of his double life. The journey to Mühlachstrasse became a descent into pure paranoia as Heinrich navigated Berlin's darkened streets under the blackout conditions that turned the familiar city into an alien landscape of shadows and muffled sounds. Every pedestrian he passed could be Gestapo surveillance. Every slow-moving vehicle could be a security patrol. Every accidental eye contact could be the moment his cover shattered. He took the long route Anna had suggested, doubling back twice to check for followers, pausing in doorways to observe the street behind him, using every counter-surveillance technique the resistance had taught him, while knowing that professional Gestapo watchers would see through these amateur precautions like tissue paper. The air raid sirens wailed their warnings into the night sky, and Heinrich felt a perverse gratitude for the Allied bombers approaching the city, because the chaos and fear they generated provided cover for movements that might otherwise draw attention. By the time he reached Mühlachstrasse, his shirt was soaked with nervous sweat despite the freezing temperature, and his hands trembled so badly he had to clench them into fists to maintain control. The bakery was exactly where Anna had described it, a narrow building wedged between a shuttered butcher shop and a building reduced to rubble by a previous bombing raid. No light showed from any of the windows, and the bakery's ground floor entrance was locked and dark, the shop clearly closed for the night. Heinrich stood across the street for a full minute, studying the building and the surrounding area, looking for anything that felt wrong, any sign that this was a trap or that the location had been compromised. The street was nearly deserted, just a few shadowy figures hurrying home before the bombers arrived, and the only sound was the distant rumble of anti-aircraft batteries preparing for the night's defense. At precisely 9 o'clock, Heinrich crossed the street and found the side entrance Anna had mentioned, a narrow door that led to the apartments above the bakery. It was unlocked. He slipped inside and began climbing stairs that creaked alarmingly under his weight, each sound feeling like an announcement of his presence to anyone listening. Sophie's apartment was on the 3rd floor, and Heinrich stood outside her door for several heartbeats before knocking the coded pattern Anna had taught him. 3 quick raps, pause, 2 more. The door opened immediately, as if Sophie had been waiting directly on the other side, and Heinrich found himself facing a woman who looked nothing like he'd imagined a resistance radio operator would look. She was perhaps 50 years old, with grey hair pulled into a severe bun, and the kind of face that belonged on a schoolteacher or a librarian, stern but not unkind. She said nothing, simply stepped aside to let him enter, and locked the door behind him with movements that spoke of practiced routine. The apartment was small and meticulously organized, its blackout curtains so heavy and well-fitted that Sophie could risk a single candle burning on the kitchen table. Heinrich saw the radio equipment immediately, a compact transceiver partially concealed inside, what appeared to be an ordinary wardrobe, its antenna cable running up the wall and presumably to the roof. Sophie spoke the recognition phrase about bread rationing. Heinrich responded with the correct counterphrase, and only then did her severe expression soften slightly into something approaching professional courtesy. She offered him water, which he declined because his hands were still shaking too badly to hold a glass, and gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table while she prepared the radio for transmission. Sophie explained in a whisper that the transmission window to London was narrow, only 15 minutes before the Gestapo's detection equipment would triangulate her signal, and that she needed him to provide the intelligence in the most compressed format possible. Heinrich had prepared for this during his walk, had mentally organized the Kaltenbrunner information into its most essential components, and he delivered it now in short, precise statements that Sophie transcribed onto a code pad using a cipher system he didn't recognize. She worked with extraordinary speed, her pencil flying across the paper, converting his spoken intelligence into encrypted letter groups that would be transmitted as Morse code across the airwaves to Allied receivers in England. The actual transmission began at 9:17, and Heinrich sat frozen at Sophie's kitchen table while she tapped out the coded message on the radio key with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The sound of the Morse code seemed impossibly loud in the small apartment, each dit and da feeling like a beacon, announcing their location to every Gestapo direction finder in Berlin. Sophie's face was utterly calm, almost serene as she worked, occasionally pausing to adjust the radio's frequency or to consult her code pad. Heinrich counted the minutes in his head, watching the candle flame flicker with each tiny air current, acutely aware that somewhere in the city, Gestapo radio detection vans might already be converging on their location, their equipment drawing an invisible net tighter around this building. At 9:29, Sophie sent her final code group, received a brief acknowledgement from London, and shut down the radio with movements so quick they seemed almost violent. She looked at Heinrich with an expression he couldn't quite read, and said something that would haunt him for years to come. The intelligence he'd provided about Kaltenbrunner and the April 23rd conference would reach Allied command within hours, and whatever they chose to do with that information, whatever operation they planned based on his intelligence, the blood would be on both their hands now, shared responsibility for whatever came next. Heinrich left Sophie's apartment 7 minutes after the transmission ended, retracing his route through Berlin's blacked-out streets with the numb sensation of someone who'd just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The Allied bombers had begun their work by then, explosions blooming in the eastern districts like terrible flowers of fire and destruction, and the anti-aircraft batteries filled the night sky with tracer rounds that arced upward in beautiful, deadly patterns. He walked through this apocalyptic landscape, barely registering the chaos around him, his mind fixed on Sophie's final words about shared blood and responsibility. For 18 months he'd gathered intelligence, encoded messages, passed information through the resistance network, but always with a comfortable layer of abstraction between his actions and their consequences. Now that abstraction had been violently stripped away. Whatever the Allies did with the Kaltenbrunner intelligence, whether they attempted an assassination or an interdiction, or simply used the conference information for strategic planning, Heinrich would know that his words spoken in that candlelit apartment had set those events in motion. The days that followed the transmission were an exercise in controlled terror, as Heinrich waited for some sign that his intelligence had been acted upon, or worse, that the Gestapo had detected Sophie's broadcast and was working backward to identify everyone involved in the operation. He continued his studio work with mechanical precision, photographing SS officers and Wehrmacht personnel, smiling and adjusting lights and making small talk while internally screaming. Klaus Richter visited for his regular monthly session and made casual observations about increased Gestapo activity in certain districts, about radio detection sweeps that had intensified recently, about how dangerous Berlin was becoming for enemies of the Reich. Every comment felt like a veiled threat, every pause in conversation like an opportunity for Richter to drop the facade and reveal that he'd known about Heinrich's activities all along. But the arrest never came, and slowly, incrementally, Heinrich began to believe he might have survived the mission. April 23rd arrived with unremarkable weather, a grey Berlin morning that gave no indication of its significance. Heinrich opened his studio at his usual time, prepared his equipment for the day's scheduled sessions, and tried not to think about what might be happening elsewhere in the city. The strategic conference Kaltenbrunner had mentioned was occurring somewhere behind closed doors, bringing together Reich leadership to discuss their murderous bureaucracy, and Heinrich had no way of knowing whether Allied intelligence had used his information to plan some kind of operation. The uncertainty was maddening. He worked through his morning appointments in a fog of distraction, and it wasn't until early afternoon that he heard the news that would confirm the impact of his espionage. A client arrived 30 minutes late, apologetic and agitated, explaining that military checkpoints had snarled traffic throughout central Berlin because of a security incident near the Reich main security office. There had been an explosion, the client said, some kind of bomb or sabotage that had killed several people and injured more. Heinrich's hands went cold as he listened to the details filtering through rumor and speculation. The explosion had occurred during a high-level SS conference, the client reported, though details were being suppressed by Reich censors. Casualties were significant enough that the Gestapo had locked down several city blocks and was conducting aggressive investigations into how such an attack could have penetrated their security. The client didn't know any names, couldn't confirm who had been killed or wounded, but the timing and location aligned perfectly with the intelligence Heinrich had provided. He completed the photography session operating purely on professional autopilot, his conscious mind consumed by the realization that people were dead because of information he'd gathered during a portrait session, because of words he'd spoken to Sophie in that candle-lit apartment, because he'd chosen to be a spy instead of just a photographer. The moral calculus the resistance had always presented was simple: better a few guilty deaths than millions of innocent ones. But standing in his studio with chemicals staining his hands and the client's casual gossip about explosions ringing in his ears, Heinrich felt the weight of those deaths with crushing immediacy. That evening, Anna arrived at his studio's back entrance looking more shaken than he'd ever seen her. She confirmed what Heinrich had already guessed. Allied intelligence had used his information to coordinate with resistance cells inside Berlin, planning an operation timed to coincide with the strategic conference Kaltenbrunner had mentioned. The bomb had killed 6 SS officers, including 2 involved in concentration camp administration, had wounded 11 more, and had thrown the Reich security apparatus into paranoid chaos. Kaltenbrunner himself had survived, a fact that Anna delivered with visible frustration, but the operation had been successful enough to disrupt high-level strategic planning and to demonstrate that Nazi leadership remained vulnerable despite their security measures. Anna told Heinrich that his intelligence work had directly contributed to saving an estimated several thousand lives by eliminating officers who would have otherwise continued implementing genocidal policies. She told him he should be proud that his courage and skill had struck a genuine blow against the Reich. But when Heinrich looked at his hands that night, alone in his apartment above the studio, all he could see was blood that no amount of photographic fixer could wash away. He had become exactly what the war demanded: a killer who worked with cameras instead of guns, an assassin who gathered intelligence instead of pulling triggers, a man who'd sacrificed pieces of his humanity in exchange for the possibility of saving others. The cyanide capsule in his pocket felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder that the price of resistance wasn't just the risk of death, but the certainty of moral compromise that would haunt him long after the shooting stopped. Heinrich Müller survived the war, though survival is perhaps too generous a word for what he carried into the decades that followed. When Berlin fell in May 1945, and Soviet forces swept through the city's shattered streets, He burned the last remnants of his resistance work and disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. He never learned the full extent of how his intelligence was used, never received official recognition for his espionage, because the resistance networks that had employed him dissolved into the fog of history, their operatives scattered or dead, or simply silent about activities that a defeated nation preferred to forget. Sophie, the radio operator, was arrested in June 1944 during a Gestapo sweep and executed 3 days later without trial. Hannah Becker survived and found Heinrich in 1947, not to reconnect, but to tell him that the network calculated his intelligence work had contributed to operations that saved an estimated 8,000 lives, a number so large and abstract that it felt meaningless compared to the 6 faces he still saw in nightmares. The SS officers who died in that April explosion because he'd been good at his job. The moral weight of what Heinrich had done never diminished, never resolved into comfortable certainty about right and wrong. He'd photographed monsters and made them look noble. He'd smiled at murderers and gathered the information that would kill them. He'd turned his art into a weapon and his studio into a battlefield where the casualties were invisible but no less real. In the clarity of post-war judgment, with the concentration camps liberated and the full scope of Nazi atrocities laid bare for the world to see, it would be easy to say that Heinrich's actions were purely heroic, that any means were justified in fighting such absolute evil. But Heinrich himself never achieved that clarity. He remembered the hands he'd shaken, the casual conversations he'd facilitated, the technical excellence he'd brought to creating portraits that families of SS officers might have cherished. He remembered that he'd continued operating his studio, continued profiting from Reich patronage, continued playing both sides of a moral divide that should have been uncrossable. The resistance had needed him to be a photographer who was secretly a spy. But what if he'd actually been a spy who was secretly still a photographer, someone who'd found a way to rationalize collaboration through the thin veneer of espionage? These are the questions that haunt resistance work in ways that conventional warfare never does. A soldier can point to the enemy across a battlefield and know with reasonable certainty that pulling the trigger serves a clear moral purpose. But a spy who shakes hands with evil, who depends on trust and intimacy to gather intelligence, who must become partially complicit in the systems they're trying to undermine, that person lives in a moral twilight where right action and collaboration blur into indistinguishable shades of grey. Heinrich had made choices that saved thousands of lives, but he'd made those choices while standing behind a camera creating propaganda portraits for the very machine that was murdering millions. Both things were true simultaneously, and he spent the rest of his life trying to reconcile them without ever quite succeeding. He never photographed another portrait after the war ended, couldn't bring himself to look through a viewfinder without seeing the faces of SS officers staring back. The question this story demands we confront is brutally simple. What would you have done? It's comfortable to imagine ourselves as heroes, to believe that we'd recognize evil and resist it without compromise, that we'd never shake the hand of a monster or facilitate their vanity even in service of espionage. But Heinrich Müller wasn't extraordinary. He was a photographer, a craftsman, an ordinary man who found himself living through extraordinary horror and made choices that were simultaneously courageous and compromised. The historical record is full of people like him, resistance workers who operated in the grey zones of occupation and collaboration, who survived by seeming to cooperate while secretly undermining, who carried the weight of their moral compromises long after the shooting stopped. We honor their courage while acknowledging their complexity, recognizing that resistance under totalitarianism rarely looks like the clean heroism we see in films. It looks like Heinrich, hands stained with chemicals, carrying cyanide in his pocket, photographing evil while fighting it, dying a little inside with every smile he manufactured for clients who deserved only hatred. This story matters because it refuses the comfort of simple narratives. It reminds us that fighting fascism demanded not just battlefield courage, but the soul-crushing work of intimate resistance, of being close enough to the enemy to gather intelligence while maintaining enough humanity to remember why you were fighting. Heinrich's photographs have been lost to history, his encoded messages dissolved into ash, his name appearing in no official records of resistance operations. But the 8,000 lives his work helped save were real, even if the 6 deaths that resulted from his April intelligence haunt his legacy with equal weight. In the final accounting, perhaps that's what resistance actually costs, not just the risk of death but the certainty of carrying moral complexity that never fully resolves, actions that were both necessary and unforgivable. Heroism that looks disturbingly like collaboration depending on the angle of light. Heinrich Müller lived with that burden for 37 years after the war ended, and when he died in 1982, his final words to the hospital chaplain were a question that echoed across decades of unresolved guilt. Did the lives he saved outweigh the compromises he made to save them? The chaplain had no answer, and perhaps that's the point. Some questions about resistance and collaboration aren't meant to be answered cleanly. They're meant to be carried, remembered, and allowed to complicate our understanding of what courage actually demands when evil wears a uniform and sits for a portrait in your studio.